It reminds us that security is at the top.
Governments look to see how do they reduce the import dependency and how do they build up their domestic energy sources.
Change in the energy system does actually take time.
The Energy Podcast from Shell, the home of conversation about the energy that powers our world. Hello and welcome back to the Energy Podcast from Shell. I'm Bryony.
And I'm Nitin.
Our new co-host.
That's right. Delighted to be here.
More about you in a second, but you've joined us at an incredibly important time. It's obviously been an extraordinary couple of months for the energy system. We've seen unprecedented disruption in the oil market. Global gas markets have been severely disrupted. Prices have risen and supplies of diesel and jet fuel, they've also been disrupted as well. There's really no other place to start than to dig a little bit deeper into this energy crisis. But before we do that, I do want to know a bit more about you, Nitin. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you very much, Bryony. So I support our trading and supply business here in London, and I've been a fan of the show for years now, so it's fantastic to be on this side of the mic.
And you and I are going to be talking a lot about this energy crisis through the rest of this season to the end of 2026. Today, we're going to be stepping back from the headlines to explore what this huge disruption may be revealing about the energy system today, but also what it might reveal in the long-term future as well.
Well, no one can say for sure, but we do have three of the sharpest minds in the business to give us a bit of their take on the crisis.
Yeah, we absolutely do. We'll be joined by Shell's Chief Energy Advisor, Peter Wood, Shell's Chief Economist, Mallika Ishwaran, and Shell's Chief Climate Advisor, David Hone.
All three are part of Shell's Scenario team. Shell Scenarios, as we know, explore how the future could unfold to help people, including Shell's leaders, make better decisions today.
Scenarios don't make predictions or determine strategy, and nor do they necessarily reflect the thinking or behaviour of the business. Okay.
Let's get started.
David, Mallika, Peter, thanks so much for joining us today. But before we get started, just give us an overview of your role. So what you do. David.
Well, all three of us are in the scenario team, and my part in that is to look at the impact that the longer-term climate issue has on the energy system.
I spend time looking at what's happening in the global macroeconomy, what the developments that we're seeing and how they might impact Shell, as well as spend time looking at what is the economics of the energy transition.
And my team basically take the input, particularly from Mallika, but also from David, and sort of look at how the energy system might evolve going forward. So where is the energy coming from and where is the demand going to be?
The head of the International Energy Agency described the crisis as the greatest threat to global energy security in history. But before we dig into that, I just want to hear the high-level take from you guys.
Well, I think it's worth just having a think about what's actually happened. We've clearly lost all the production from Qatar, we've lost the production from Kuwait, most of the production from Iraq. Saudi production is reduced a bit, but a lot of it's going through a pipeline out to the Red Sea. And of course, Iranian production has been significantly impacted. So there's it's quite a tumultuous event, but we've been here before. I'm older than my esteemed colleagues on the couch, and I remember well the 1990 invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, and at the time this was an enormous event. We lost all of the production of Iraq because it was embargoed. Kuwait, of course, had been invaded. Saudi Arabia was being attacked by missiles, and so it was heavily disrupted. On the day, it seemed like an event that we just weren't going to get past, and yet the world did. The system is very resilient, and so yes, it's a crisis, and yes, it's disruptive, but don't be surprised if the system sort of sorts itself out.
So the economy today is quite different from what it was in the 70s and 80s. The economy overall is less energy intensive than it was then. People spend less of their budget or their incomes on energy than they did then. And also what we're seeing today is we have many more alternatives, renewables, low carbon alternatives, sources of energy. But that said, we're still seeing that this oil and gas sort of disruption that we're seeing in the Middle East is having a significant impact on the economy.
I think before this happened, if you'd asked us what would happen if the Straits of Hormuz had closed, I think many people would have said, well, it'll be $200 a barrel and there'll be blue lights flashing everywhere in emergency. The fact of the matter hasn't really transpired. The energy system, I think, has behaved fairly well for a number of different reasons. It was probably a fair amount of supply around before we came into this. Then we've been able to draw down on reserves. And then, as Mallika said, there are other energy sources available. So the system is sort of balanced so far. In rich countries, you haven't seen too much of an impact. Fuel prices have gone up a bit, but not that much. But in poorer countries, particularly in Asia, there has been a more profound impact. We have colleagues who are living in India who, are struggling to get a hold of LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, to cook with. And it's very evident that air travel has been reduced in Asia. So quite a big shock.
So you've sort of touched upon there what it's revealed about the energy system, but does it, in your opinion, have an impact on the energy system fundamentally? Is it going to change things?
You can't, or you shouldn't overestimate shocks in the sense of, in the short term, we're likely to revert back to the mean for the most part. People will go back to cooking with LPG. They will get back into aeroplanes flying around. I think the question is what will happen in the medium to long term, and there we shouldn't underestimate how a shock can precipitate change, but that will be over, potentially decades.
Do you agree with that, Mallika? You're nodding, yeah.
I do, but I also think that what we're seeing today, this sort of energy crisis, and by the way, this is the second one in 5 years. Ukraine happened in 2022.
Yeah.
I think it's a symptom also of the fact that the energy system is evolving. We're moving towards a more low carbon energy system. And during this transition, I would expect as an economist that the elasticity of supply, or the ability of supply to accommodate and adjust for disruptions, is reduced. And so even when you have relatively minor disruptions, and I'm not saying this is a big one, but if you have even relatively minor disruptions, you'll see big oil price and energy price volatility in markets because of that inability of supply to adjust. And what we're seeing today is a sort of a symptom of that transition and movement in the energy system to fundamentally change from what it is today to what we expect it's going to be over the next few decades.
I was going to say the oil price has actually been remarkably not stable, but it certainly hasn't done what some people were imagining. We were sort of in the $60 to $70 range, and although we spiked very briefly at 110, a bit more, we've sort of been in the $90 to $100 range, which is a sort of 40 to 50% increase. So I was in Shell trading back in 1990, and you talk about volatility. So the oil price doubled, at least. We even had one day where the oil price doubled and halved on the same day.
On the same day?
On the same day. And not to sort of disagree with Mallika, but I think what we're seeing actually is a system that is quite resilient and has other supply options, both oil and non-oil options. And therefore, that's why the price to some extent has been, or the volatility's been muted, I would say. But it's still been a tough time. I don't want to take away from that.
Yeah.
Energy demand is continuing to rise. It's driving living standards. People want to travel more. They want a warm house or a cool house, more computers, more data centers, these sorts of things. So I don't think that will change. I think what's maybe a more interesting question, which we're looking to, is what will people take away from this crisis? And over the next 2 or 3 years, might they start to change, particularly governments, might they change their policies? A little bit more efficiency, more of a push on that. Faster adoption of electric vehicles, exploration for oil and gas. Should we maybe keep those coal plants burning for a little bit longer because they've proven to be very resilient in India, China? So I think you'll see policymakers reflecting on this, and we will maybe see the impact 5 to 10 years out, when we maybe get a bit of a bend in the curve. But, remains to be seen.
One of the things we've learned from past crises, energy crises, is that it usually leads to a structural improvement in energy efficiency. So the 70s and 80s, what we saw, the spikes in oil prices, led to really sort of vehicle efficiency going up, either through the bringing in of mandatory standards for vehicle efficiency, or just in terms of vehicle design. And so to improve that. So I think even after this, one of the things I would look for structurally is what is happening to energy efficiency, and how is there a step change that we're seeing in that?
Could I just add to that, though, because it's absolutely true. Engines became a lot more efficient, but then vehicles started to become a lot bigger. So you reduce the consumption for the amount of energy you need, the amount of power, but then you get a bigger car and actually you go back up again.
Yeah.
So there's offsetting factors here.
And in fact, energy efficiency's always been a double-edged sword. Obviously, it's the right thing to do, use less to get more. Every time in human history that has happened, we've ended up using even more energy. This goes back to a famous 19th century economist. It's called Givon's paradox. And he noted that as steel production in the UK became more efficient and coal use became more efficient, the demand increased. And this will happen again. It's happened through digitization, it's happened through energy efficiency itself. All of these things quite often lead to more energy demand.
But a lot of that energy demand would have come in any case as countries develop, and maybe it came sooner.
Well, I think it also opens the door to do more things with energy. You know, we do things today with energy that we perhaps weren't doing in the 80s or the 70s. You just look at your house, look at the, you know, when I was a kid, you had one television. Nobody had 4 televisions in there. You didn't have to go into every room and there was a television. Yet today, that is not uncommon in many houses.
When you look back at it in maybe 10, 20 years' time, how would you reflect upon this period?
I don't think shocks like this are ever temporary. They leave a long trail of change. And you think back to even further, you go back to the first oil shocks, which were in the 70s as OPEC was formed. And remember, they had gasoline queues in the United States and in other parts of the world. And it set off a chain of events in terms of research, development, for solar PV, for example, for wind turbines, for horizontal drilling, which led to, you know, fracturing and fracking and so on. And all of those things, here we are 40, 50 years later, are becoming big commercial vectors for change. And I think that's similarly the case with all of these changes over the year, all of these disruptions over the years. They leave a legacy that sometimes it takes a lot to think about that legacy in terms of that event.
I want to come on to the energy trilemma. And I know, Peter, we've spoken about this on this podcast a few times. So that need to balance energy security, affordability and sustainability. How does this crisis impact that balance?
Well, it reminds us that security is at the top.
So it's not balanced then, security is at the top.
People have a very low tolerance for not getting the energy they want. And you can see how hard governments have worked during this crisis. So we were saying, you know, that price hasn't responded that much. That's because supply has, and in particular, drawing from strategic stocks. So the world's got somewhere between 8 and 9 billion barrels of oil in tanks. Depends a bit how you measure it, but we've taken just over 1 billion barrels out of those tanks to allow people to continue living their life the way they want to. Now that's a lot of resources that have been put there to try and manage. And that hasn't managed price everywhere and availability everywhere. I think in Europe, North America, richer countries have done okay, but I think in poorer countries, you've really felt this. But I think as David put it quite well, you know, these things play out over a long period of time. So the trilemma isn't going away. It's finding a balance. And what you find is at any one moment in time, one thing prioritizes over another. So a few years ago, it was very much around climate. Then it became affordability. Now it's availability, and it will just balance backwards and forwards. And it's been doing that for, I think, the last 100 years, and I expect it to do it for the next 100.
Mallika, do you put any security at the top?
I do. I think it's a good rebalance. So I think it's not that one was sort of it was just the balance between them was sort of shifted towards climate. That's right. And then now it's rebalancing towards affordability and security. But what I find interesting is how governments who are navigating this are trying to find the synergies. So we talk a lot about the trade-offs between the trilemma objectives. We're finding them moving more into the space of finding where are the synergies between these three. So I'll give an example. For example, we're seeing the energy security lens, both as a result of Ukraine and now what we're seeing. And you're seeing governments look to see how do they reduce the import dependency. And mostly imported energy is oil and gas. Sure. And how do they build up their domestic energy sources? And many of the growing energy markets of the world, the Indias, the Chinas, Asia, the domestic, most abundant domestic source of energy is renewables. So you're seeing a win-win between energy security and sustainability. Now, another example, countries are also seeing, do they have domestic oil and gas resources to develop them in order to meet economic growth objectives, to poverty alleviation objectives. We're seeing it in the context of the build out of data centers. How do you meet that demand? But also as a way to then cushion the system as it moves towards low carbon, to provide that sort of balancing. And so I think we're starting to see more of the synergies coming through, rather than viewing this as a trade-off between the three objectives.
Yeah, I mean, the way we often picture this on a graphic is as a triangle. The geometry of a triangle is locked. The three pieces, they can't just sort of swing or move all over the place. And I think that's true of the trilemma. I mean, I agree with Peter, you have to have energy just to live your daily life. But ultimately, if you pay enough, you can always get energy. But that's not a reality of the world. We can't just all pay what we want to pay just for the energy that we need. And, the environmental consequences of whatever we do, they may play out over the short term or over a much longer term. So I think the three remain locked in step, and there's not really an order of priority in the sense of, well, this is most important and then this is second, or we don't really worry about that till later. They sit together. Yeah.
And just to say on that, paying, we sit in the West here and we're sort of able to pay for higher cost of energy. Yeah. But in a lot of parts of the world, what we've seen is that it's just physically, first of all, they're not able to pay for it. The affordability issue is huge. Energy is just physically constrained in those economies.
Following on from that then, what are we learning about the system's resilience? And of course, when we talk about the system's resilience in the context of the energy industry, we're talking about the need for markets or countries to insulate against crises like this. And what is it showing? Is it showing that there might be a change in where it might come from in the future?
I actually want to start with reliability and then resilience. So reliability is how often this stuff comes. And if you look in a rich country, energy is extremely reliable. Think of a time that you've been to a petrol station and there wasn't any available. It's very little. Electricity, you have downtime of about half an hour a year. Natural gas networks, about 2 minutes a year. It's extremely reliable, and that's the basis for prosperity, both in terms of how we create wealth, but also how we consume. Mm-hmm. Resilience is how we recover from shocks. So why is that important? Well, we've spoken about shocks. The last 50 years, you've had wars, you've had coal miners strike in the UK, you've had nuclear outages, you've had storms, and that's just a subset of shocks. There are other shocks that we haven't experienced. There could be electromagnetic storms. There can be volcanic eruptions that disrupt the atmosphere, keep it cool for a year. So the system has to be able to absorb all of that. And I think if you look on the molecular side, the starting point is storage. It's relatively easy to store it. So it's piles of coal, tanks of oil and LNG, underground gas storage, and other fuels that you keep as backup. On the electricity side, it's much more expensive to store electricity. People talk about batteries, but they're not such a big thing yet for long duration. So there you manage it by redundancy. You have lots of different generation sources. So you've got fossil, coal, gas, but you've also got nuclear. You've also got renewables. You've also got hydro. And you have enough redundancy that at any one time, one of those will be able to deliver. That's how you're resilient. Then I think the other thing that we've touched on already is the rise of renewable energy. And I think probably nuclear going forward. These are, predominantly homegrown energy, and we're going to see more emphasis on resilience that they can bring to a system. But at the same time, coal is also getting a bit of a pat on the back here. In many countries, it's helping them get through this shock. So the idea that we're going to be able to shut down coal plants and it's all going to go away tomorrow, I think that's got delayed as well.
Yeah.
So if I can insert another lens on this, as you'd imagine, I come with a slightly different lens. As an economist, I think diversification is going to be the push for most governments, most countries to get resilience. And diversification is diversifying away from the Middle East. And then I think the other is diversifying from fossil fuels. So again, the renewables, nuclear. I think it's energy security that will drive it.
Right.
So I think the drivers for change, I think we're moving into a world where the transition is looked at through its core benefits that it provides. So it's not doing the energy transition for its sake. It's about what does it do in terms of energy security? What does it do in terms of industrial competitiveness? What does it do in terms of local air pollution and other sort of issues? So in some sense, this widening of the drivers of energy transition to the core benefits actually makes it a little bit more resilient that is likely to happen. It's not just sort of hinging on the fact that countries have made commitments to reduce emissions. There are other really sort of economic benefits that they're getting out of it, which to me makes it a little bit more resilient, the transition itself.
Yeah, so I think maybe we can learn a bit from the past. If you look at a country like Japan, Japan was pretty heavily impacted by the oil crises of the 1970s. It sort of set about how could we make ourselves a lot more resilient. Now, Japan doesn't have a lot of fossil fuel resources, and its renewable resources are maybe not as strong as some places. But look at what Japan has done. So it went big in nuclear. It diversified its suppliers. So big in LNG, but sourcing from a number of different places. Big in oil, sourcing from a number of different places. Big strategic reserves. Big push on efficiency. If you go to a Japanese city, see how small the cars are, see how compact the living is. They have built a society that is structurally more efficient and more resilient to shocks than many European countries. Now, they've done that by government and industry working together. So I think going forward, we're going to see more of those behaviors in European countries.
Fascinating.
There's another great example actually coming from the 70s as well, which is Brazil.
Right.
They were hit hard in the 70s because they were completely reliant on oil at that time, particularly coming into the country, and the price of oil. And as a result of the oil shocks in that era, they've become a biofuel economy and a biomass economy. Brazil started the journey towards putting ethanol in cars, ethanol made from its abundant sugarcane. And that has only continued to the point today where most of the cars in Brazil run on ethanol or at least an ethanol gasoline mix. They've developed their own oil industry and they're a major producer in the region. They've expanded hydroelectricity across the country and built grids that other countries would look at awe in and wish they had them as well, including some of the major OECD countries. Mm-hmm. All of this, it's part of Brazil's development journey, but it's also got in it the seeds of a real shock in the 70s that they've worked towards assuring doesn't happen again.
Right. So what I'm generally hearing is that crises like this teach us to reduce single source reliance and go towards diversification.
Yes, diversification in terms of where your oil and gas is coming from, and diversification in terms of the energy sources,
Right.
broadening it out to low carbon also to meet your needs.
And look who the world's biggest producer of oil and gas is today. It's the United States. 20 years ago, parts of the US economy were worried that the production was falling so quickly and to such a low level that they'd have to reserve some supply for domestic use. Now they've become an exporter.
What does this moment mean for the pace and the pathway of the energy transition?
So I think this is where our other discipline comes in that we haven't mentioned yet, which is scenarios.
That's right.
So all three of us, as you've said, work in the Shell scenario team. There is no single answer to this. And we shouldn't just imagine that because you get a shock and therefore because everything sort of looks a bit pear-shaped, that therefore it's all going to change and go to something else. If you look at the current energy security scenarios that were updated and published again in January of this year, I think there's two scenarios that really stand out. One is we call archipelagos, and that is a world of quite some security tensions, a bit like what we're seeing at the moment. It actually leads to a less pacey transition. And I'm not going to say a slower transition because then people will think that it slows down. Right. It's still quite a rapid transition, but it's not as fast as you could imagine. And certainly not as fast as the other scenario that I'll mention in a moment. So what happens in archipelagos is that countries hunker down. They draw on their coal reserves. They look at the domestic resources they have, such as in North America, the abundance of oil and gas, and they start producing more. And this is the fastest pathway to ensuring real security. It's a security scenario in the sort of the difficult sense, not just in the I haven't got enough energy for my plane ride today. And so as a result of that, the transition slows down. It's a more fraught scenario, so there's lower global growth, and therefore there's less money to put into things like the transition. So all of this leads to a less pacey transition. On the other hand, we've got another scenario called surge, which you can see bubbling up. And we had a great example of it bubbling up, fairly recently with the IPO of SpaceX. There's a lot of excitement about new technologies, about AI, about digitization around the world. You get a surge in growth, hence the name of the scenario. You get a very rapid energy transition because the resources become available and the manufacturing techniques and the technologies become available to drive change. And
Right.
both of those scenarios could emerge from where we are today.
I completely agree with that. And I would just add that what we are seeing is different countries are choosing different pathways. So there isn't one top-down formula. So depending on whether it meets their resource endowments, whether it meets the industrial competitiveness, whether it meets the energy security goals, they're choosing different pathways and different priorities. So I would agree that having a fragmenting world does create headwinds. But at the same time, it creates pockets where you can actually have acceleration on certain technologies or certain sectors. So it's a little bit uneven.
I think you've got to be careful not to overestimate what shocks can do for you in the short term, but also not underestimate what they might do in the long term. So if you think about COVID, we were all at home, we learnt to run our company from our spare bedrooms, basically. Yet here we are 6 years later, and we're all sort of being called back to the office at least 3 days a week. And you can see that in fuel usage. We've lost about 500,000 barrels a day of gasoline demand. Out of 25 million barrels a day, we've lost 500,000 barrels because people are working from home a bit more, predominantly in North America. Relatively small change. So you see at the time when the shock is going on, the world is going to change fundamentally, and then you come out of it and it reverts back and you think, well, nothing's changed, but actually you go further out, things have changed. So it's getting those two different things in your mind.
Yeah.
And there is a reason behind that as well. And the big reason is that change in the energy system does actually take time. It takes about a generation, so 20, 25 years for a nascent laboratory technology to maybe get to 1% of the energy system. And it takes another 25 years for that 1% to grow to some meaningful and tangible level, 20% or whatever the number happens to be. So, that's 2 generations of change to go from something that really didn't exist to something that has found its place. And that's, so you're now thinking 50 years out, 2075, 2076, to see potentially something fundamentally different that people might ultimately say, if the events of the 2020s hadn't been the way they were, and let's be clear, not just the current events, but we've had the Ukraine event, we've had COVID, so we had lots of events of the 2020s.
I would trace it back to the financial crisis.
Yes,
even.
that too,
Yeah,
yes.
That's right, yeah.
It might be 50 years before we look back and say, well, we're here in this completely different energy system, and really it's you can trace it back to these things that happened at some point in this sort of 10 or 15 years.
I want to actually reflect on what that means for a company like Shell, of course. Global energy company at the heart of a system under strain, right? What extent does a crisis like this require maybe a change in focus?
I don't think it requires a change in focus in the short term. I think it requires a doubling down of focus in the short term. So we serve, I think, around 30 million people a day in our service stations, our petrol stations. We have other customers, but let's just take that group. They want their fuel. So as an organization, we need to double down on being able to deliver that. So, that's safe operations. We have a number of several thousand people working in the Middle East. It's keeping our assets going. It's making sure our trading and supply businesses has the resources that can manage the volatility. Keep people fueled, that will keep your company healthy. Look at your performance, that will keep your balance sheet in shape, and then you'll be able to see through another crisis.
Yeah, there's a famous line that sort of I'm thinking of, and since I've talked about it a couple of times, you go back to the 1990 energy crisis because of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and there was a famous line that Margaret Thatcher supposedly said to George Bush, which is, "Oh, this is no time to get wobbly." And I think that's true today, as Peter, really highlighted by Peter, that yes, our customers are relying on us today. They need the products that we produce. And the last few months I've been immersed in aviation because we've just released an aviation scenario. I've had a few people come up to me who are, from airlines and with slightly worried looks on their faces. Well, we're all going to get our jet fuel, aren't we? So this is because jet fuel prices have escalated, there's a lot of jet fuel production in the Gulf. And so there's a concern amongst customers, and they look to a company like Shell to be that provider in good times and tough times.
So I'd say three things to me come out of this. Firstly, that oil and gas is required for the next few decades. And that's something our scenarios show. Even with the ambitious decarbonization trajectory, you still need oil and gas.
So you see that as a fundamental?
I think that's right. Yeah, and that's what this crisis has also brought home. I think volatility is here to stay for the reasons I mentioned earlier. This sort of inelasticity in supply means we are just going to have to get used to a period of just volatility for the next decade, say. And the third thing is picking up the longer term, the transition is happening, but it's happening in a very uneven way in different parts of the world, in different sectors. Yeah. So we need to be able to keep an eye on what those developments are and be able to assess and seize those opportunities when they suit us. So I think it's a very dynamic kind of environment that we're going into.
And I think, Shell will change over time. In my career, which is considerably longer than you guys, probably I
was still around in the 90s.
Yes.
Just to say.
We're all here in the 90s. Oh.
Yes, but my career predates that. When I joined, Shell was very much a production and refining company. With refining actually big R and a smaller P. We were a refining company. Today, we're an LNG company, we're a production company, we're probably the world's biggest trading company.
Yeah.
And we've got a huge retail presence. We had a big retail presence then, of course. But, the pillars on which the company sits have shifted over the decades. And that will continue, I think. But it's something that you measure in decades, not in years. But also, we won't wake up tomorrow morning and go, oh, the energy system changed, and we're not there. Because the energy system's got to go through quite a long journey. And even coming out the other side of a major transition that may take 50 years, there's still also going to be a very long tail of oil and gas that goes probably into the next century. That doesn't mean we're dependent on it as the major energy source, but this tail will go on for a long time.
I mean, when people talk about it, they talk about energy supply, like, you just change energy supply. But that's not, you're changing the whole system. So you're changing how demand, how it's consumed. You're also changing how it's moved around or stored, because you're moving from one system to a very fundamentally different system. And that takes time. It's not just like, we just stopped doing oil and gas. No. You need to have the demand there for the electrons or whatever the low carbon molecules are. You need to have the infrastructure, grids, CO2 pipelines or hydrogen pipelines. You need to have all of this in. And that's going to take a while to build out. It's not going to be something that's just you click your fingers and you're done.
Yeah. So. And LNG is a good example of that. The first LNG cargoes were in the late 50s, I think.
Even before you started working.
Even before I started working.
Making us a lot younger.
Closer to when I was born. But the point is that LNG is an important part of the energy system today, and it's grown and developed and expanded. When Shell first got into LNG back in I think it was in the 70s, people were questioning, what are you doing that for? You know, that's never going to work. And yet, look, today it's one of the pillars of the company.
I feel like it's ended on a positive note. And Peter Smalley,
And if there's any young people listening, please come and join us.
Yeah.
Help us.
David, Mallika, and Peter, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Such an interesting discussion. Of course, we'll continue to explore the implications of the energy crisis in the episodes ahead.
Absolutely. So follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss out on what's coming next.
Remember, you can find Shell's cautionary note and the statements in relation to Shell scenarios on Shell's website. The link to that is in our show notes.
Thank you for joining us.
Bye for now.